Okay, in the last lecture, what we did, looking at the economic insights into competition and government intervention, and we said the point of departure is to have a look at what happens if we have a competitive market with no government intervention. So that's what we looked at in the last session. We're now going to look at why government thinks, or why economists and people in general think the government should intervene. And that's a very important concept of market failure. So in this session, we're going to look at the meaning of market failure. So let us just recap as to where we were, so you can see how it works. Economic theory contributes considerably to our understanding of how and why economics work, and how individuals act and behave in an economic setting. The most common economic activities which we got involved to a large extent exchange transaction. There are a whole lot of other actions, activities which individuals are concerned with, but we're really concerned about the economic activities, and those usually involve exchange transaction. And the most common exchange, which you know, you go to the shop, you want to buy a cold drink or some food, is exchange of goods and services, which is provided by a supplier, for money which is paid by the consumers. Now, as this can be quite a complicated area, and we want to approach this from first or fundamental principles. And by that, we really want to approach it from a way that if we think about things in the real world, in a practical sense, what do we see, and how do we explain what we can see? There are different markets which could be involved. So if you want to sell your motor car, it would be you negotiating with another individual. Those are fairly isolated nowadays, and most transactions take place in large markets. Think about when you want to buy food, coal, cars, mobile phones, insurance, so on. There's a market of suppliers and yourself. So we're not going to look at individuals per se entering as a person entering into a transaction in quite a large market. That's the one we have to get. So first one we looked at is the economic insights to the competitive market. Now we're going to have economic insights into market failure. And part three, we're going to have a look at what happens when the government intervenes into the private market. Because today we will look at it and say, in theory, we can see the government should intervene. But I said this is really to look at things from a point of practice. So let's have a look in practice what happens when governments intervene. Today we look at why economists believe. I will emphasize economists because government intervention takes place without talking to economists. So it's not that the economists have a monopoly on explanations, but this is a theory which economists have come up, which we explain government intervention. And that's the idea of market failure. So part two, let's look at what is meant by market failure. Now, just to recap, this is what we looked at previously. Just assume you have somebody that wants to purchase something from a supplier. There's no competition. How much will that person pay? The person will pay what economists, going back to Alfred Marshall, what he called the amount willing to pay. So we say, how much do you think this is worth? So let's assume that we have an item which costs the supplier 1,800 to manufacture, put it on the market, and the consumer is willing to pay 5,000 rand. So in this case, there would be a substantial markup. Now that's a non-competitive market. So what happens when we get a competitive market? So we continue with, on the left-hand side, we continue with a non-competitive market, and then on the right-hand side, we see what happens when you get competition. Now you can see from this, two things happen. You can see the price is reduced considerably. So instead of the consumer paying the amount the consumer is willing to pay, there is a market price. So he will pay a market price, which is considerably lower than the amount that he is willing to pay. But there's a second, really usually unforgotten aspect which takes place. You notice the expenses have also gone down. It was 1,800, it's gone down to 1,700. Now, why would that happen? It's because in a competitive market, the supplier is now trying to get a profit from the market. he finds he can't do much on the price side because other competitors will set the price. And so all he can do is try and operate more efficiently. And so he will then reduce the cost as efficiently as he can. That's very important because then you get an optimum resource allocation. The resources which are available are then used more efficiently. In fact, the most efficient way that we can get. So that simple diagram tells us all that we want to know. There's two, we see Q1 and Q2. What are those two? The Q1s would be the quantity. The supplier will find that as he reduces his price, the quantity will go up. More consumers will buy, and therefore more consumers will get the benefit of the market. So, as you can see, it's really quite straightforward. We don't need any economists, we don't need any theory. All we need to do is realize what happens when things happen. So it's what Sir Francis Bacon was one of the starters of the idea of the scientific method of research. Said it is the reality which exists in your mind. You don't have to go and watch anybody do it. We all know this is what happens, and so you can see what happens. So there's the Q1, Q2, and the yellow there is the benefit that the consumer gets. The consumer pays a lower price. Because he pays a lower price, more consumers can enter into the market. In the end, they all trade at the market price at QT. And so the yellow triangle there comes from Alfred Marshall, who was a Cambridge economist who was the first one to think this out. That's known as Alfred Marshall's consumer's surplus. Very important, if you're an economist, is to note where the apostrophe is. It's after the S. First of all, you have to note it has a apostrophe. The surplus belongs to the consumer. And it's not a surplus which belongs to all consumers. It belongs to every consumer individually. So every time you buy something in a market, you're paying the lowest price, the lowest cost, and you are getting a benefit because if the market was not there, you'd be paying a lot more and it'd be less efficient. So quite a beautiful diagram if you understand the theory correctly. So we can summarize the outcomes from a competitive market. First outcome is it provides the consumers with a maximum consumer surplus, that yellow triangle. Now, some people would prefer not to get all of these technical concepts such as consumer surplus. And so to give it the easiest possible way, it eliminates monopoly profits. Economists say in a competitive market, there are zero economic profits. Some economists don't understand that, and they say zero profits, zero economic profits. There will always be some profits because the profit pays the shareholder for his capital. And if you didn't pay the shareholder for his capital, you wouldn't get the capital. So if we didn't get the capital, we'd get no markets. And so you're simply paying to be able to get the market which you get. So it eliminates monopoly profits. Some economists might say excessive profits, but the terminology economists is you end up with zero economic profits. The only profits you're going to get is the profits which are necessary to pay everybody for what they've got. Look, you know, the idea of monopoly profits and consumer surplus that came to us from Cambridge's great economist, which is Alfred Marshall, turn of the century. Alfred Marshall had a protege which was called Pigot, A.C. Pigot, and A.C. Pigot then, after Marshall retired, continued to work in the field and gave us some other valuable concepts. One which one can debate how valuable it is, but one important concept was the idea of economic welfare. Now, it's easy to get confused with economic welfare and social welfare and welfare in any other sense. In the end, you could say if you go along Pigot's path long enough, you'll come out on the other side with one form of welfare. But Pigot didn't go that far. What he argued is that if Marshall is correct, consumers get the lowest possible price, it allows more consumers to purchase, then consumers will get the best deal which is possible. So to put it bluntly, and if you change the word from welfare to happiness or satisfaction, the free market gives the consumers the greatest possible satisfaction they can ever get from any other system. It is the ideal system which you can get. You can't beat it. Lowest cost, lowest price, more consumers can purchase, because lower cost of money which you've got, you can then purchase other products. So you get the best possible deal which you could think of. And if you don't like the word consumer welfare, you can say happiness, satisfaction, the best satisfaction you can get. So the second outcome is what's the maximum total economic welfare, maximum happiness. Now, you can't measure happiness, and that gives, or gave, and still gives people quite a lot of problems. And it becomes what one could say is a fairly abstract concept. 50 or so, or 30 or so, 20 or so years later, an engineer came along with a different idea, which is the Pareto, which didn't use happiness, and you end up in the same place, and that is Pareto optimality. So the old form of total economic welfare, which we call the Pigovian one, and the new form is the Pareto optimal. That's more practical, more conceptual. And the Pareto optimal says that no consumer can profit off another consumer. The market is in such a way that when you're entering into a market, no other consumer in that market is going to profit off you. Or putting it another way, converse to that, when you enter into that market, you cannot prejudice any other consumer. Now, maybe the shareholder can profit over you, maybe other people can profit over you, but another consumer can never profit off you, and you can never profit off another consumer. Now, if you have a market where one consumer is busy profiting off another consumer, then you can say that's not a Pareto optimal market. And to many economists, as time progressed, the Pareto optimality became the gold standard. So, is this a good or bad market? The question is it Pareto optimal or not? At about the same time, for reasons which you can already imagine, if you go and think about the diagram which we looked at, the cost went down further. Now, how far can that go? Cost go down? The cost go down in its lowest possible way, because if somebody could find a way of making it cheaper, then they would make the profits, and then other people would lose the market, so they would also have to find out another way. So you end up with the lowest possible cost, and therefore the resources which you allocate to be able to supply the market, you can't reduce it in any other way, and you can't distribute any other way. So the third thing that you'll get out from a competitive market, lowest cost of production, the widest range of choice. Why is that? Because there are suppliers who would like to sell you something, and so they will keep thinking of what else can they sell you, what other way can they sell it, how can they sell it to you. So they will keep coming up with a wide range of choices which you can get, which anybody who's used the internet will know. Go on the internet, and which I did the other day. I wanted to look for the UPS. Next time I logged onto and this is the Google search engine. The next time I logged on, I got advertisements from all around the world for UPS. So, Google has found a way of knowing what consumers want and then give them the widest possible range. And the last thing is the most efficient distribution of those products to society. Doesn't matter where you are. Probably the most well-known example is Coca-Cola. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, smallest possible island, there it is. So no other system known to man can achieve that. And the last requirement, or the last benefit, is the maximum innovation. As suppliers try to find ways to meet consumers' demands, so they will get more and more creative to try and achieve that. And that's why over in our own lifetime, we think of products which we didn't even dream of exist. They've come, gone, and been replaced by others. So those are the outcomes of the competitive market. Fantastic. So with these fantastic outcomes, why doesn't the world just leave the market alone and everybody would become quite happy? No, fantastic. Not only be happy, couldn't be happier. It's the best happiness that we can get. Nobody can find another way. There is an amusing story which you can check this. Amusing to me, and maybe amusing to anybody else now that I will tell them. There is no system known to man that can do and produce these outcomes. None. The alternative system was central planning. And central planning can't do it, and it can't work out the price. Now, you'll remember in the 1980s, the Berlin Wall came down. And the man who was responsible, and it came down when Ronald Reagan presented a fantastic speech. And in that speech, he uses these magic words, Mr. Gorbachev, pull down the wall. It's quite a amusing story. Those words were put into that speech by Peter Robinson. And Peter Robinson has a chat room, which you can go and listen to his presentations, Uncommon Knowledge. And when it came to the celebration, I think the 30th or 40th year, Peter Robinson decided to interview all the different people that he could. And he then interviewed Schultz, who was the Secretary General or State, Secretary of State at the time when the war came down. And so he met with Gorbachev. And so Peter Robinson says to Schultz, and you must go and look it up and see it for yourself, because it's really quite fantastic when you see it. Now, Schultz meets Gorbachev, and so Peter Robinson says, well, what did you talk about? He said, strangely, the first question he asked me, now think about this, whole of communism, there's all these questions. The first question he asked me is, how do you determine the price? Nothing but the free market can determine the price. There's no other way of doing it. These outcomes can't be achieved any other way. Now, in theory, we should go home now and switch off and say, look, there's nothing further to talk about because the market solves all the problems. But we know that life has gone on. Why has life gone on? That's the quotation which I gave you from Paul Samuelson to tell you that in the minds of economists licensed Adam Smith, they've always had the feeling, which I have now expressed to you, that the competitive market somehow represents the best possible outcome. Nothing to beat it. So that feeling which I've now tried to convey, well-known feeling to economists, always been it. So why is it? No, the answer is market failure. There's another concept which came up, market failure. So the way I put it in question and answer, if the free market is fantastic, why interfere? Well, the answer is people have said the market fails. There's market failure. So to them, market failure equals government intervention, or government intervention equals market failure. It doesn't matter which way. If the government intervenes, they'll say, no, it's because of, economists will say it's because of market failure. And if we can demonstrate an actual market failure, then the government will intervene. So what does market failure mean? What's this mysterious word which has come up now, which has said, well, a whole fantastic story which I've conveyed, which is such common sense and so clear to anybody who just thinks about it. What is it that is doing? Now, I want to introduce you to a very common problem. It's actually quite an amazing problem to me. If you give something a label, then people provide a context to conform to the label. So if you say there's a thing called market failure, and therefore when it fails, government intervention will come. And they say, I don't know what you mean by market failure, but I can tell you when I think the government should intervene. Now that's when they should intervene, that's when they should intervene. They say, well, what does that mean? No, that means there's market failure. So people work backwards. And it's quite an amazing, once you realize this, to see how often this happens. Could give you a couple of other examples to show what happens. So one of the things that's happened is market failure has lost its meaning. So market failure is simply an excuse when you think government should intervene, but it's not true. It's got a technical meaning, which we want to have a look at it. So it's just a bit strange that this thing happens. So as an academic, one of the jobs that I get every now and then is to review articles. Academics submit articles to academic journals. And then the international good practice, one which all academic journals follow, it's called a double-blind peer review system. The editor has to send it to somebody else. And sometimes I get articles from around the world, and then some of these articles have to talk about market failure. And then I have to go back and say, look, if it's going to appear in an academic journal, then it must at least understand the literature. We can't just put market failure meaning anything. So one article that came to me, the author wrote and said, market failure is when a government intervention does not work. But that's exactly the opposite. So what he's saying is when the government fails, then that's market failure. So I had to send back and say, look, I really think unless he understands market failure in a correct sense, or at least attempts to do that, then I can't give any assistance on that. So market failure doesn't mean I think the market has failed and the government should intervene. The market has a particular meaning which we all know, we should know about, we know about, and if you know about it now, then you know more than a large number of academics who've been learning at some of the universities around the world. So market failure is a technical term with a technical meaning. It was first introduced by an academic by the name of Francis Bacon in 1956. He died recently, quite sadly. He lived to quite a ripe old age. And I read the other day, or not a year or so, he stepped off the curb to cross the road. He wasn't looking and he got killed by a motor car. So it's rather sad. But it is in 1956, a very famous article. So when I teach this at the postgraduate level, it's a prescribed article, so students have to read it. So we will not, from the graduates I have in my class at least, they will not be saying, when the government fails, that's market failure. They will say market failure is as originally set out by Francis Bacon. Now, in his sense, the sense he used it, it's a Pareto optimal market. So if the market is Pareto optimal, then it is. Remember, the Pareto optimal market is a market in which no other consumer is worse off because you've entered in the market, and you are not worse off because another consumer enters into the market. And if the market is not Pareto optimal, market failure has occurred, and then the argument the government may intervene to produce the optimal result. Now, in the third lecture, we're going to have a look at, we want to see whether the government actually succeeds in that point. We have a situation you can say, okay, in this case, we can see that the market is not optimal, therefore the government must intervene. But you've got to say, if the government intervenes, then it's to make the market optimal. So we have to ask ourselves whether the government actually achieves that. Now, we're not going to do that in this lecture, but we will do it in the next lecture, and we will have a look particularly at the South African market's intervention and see whether they could achieve that. So the logic is clear enough. If the market is not at the optimum, doesn't give us those four possible outcomes, and the government can intervene to be able to improve the market to give us those four outcomes, then government intervention is justified. Now, under those circumstances, the government will probably never intervene, because it can't intervene to achieve it, and it can't intervene in a cost beneficial way. But we leave that to the next lecture, which we're going to have. So, to get the meaning correct, so when people tell you market failure, just check whether they know what it means and whether they're using it correctly. Market failure occurs when a market does not produce the optimum outcomes. And as I had said to many economists, they will concentrate just on the Pareto optimality and not worry about the others. I think we should look at both. And the other question is, when people say markets has failed, do they actually look to see whether these optimum outcomes exist or do not exist, or do they look for something else? We'll look at that a little bit in the slide. Okay, if the government intervenes, it should only be to restore the market to its optimum position. So the case which I have already referred to, where somebody says the government, if the government fails to achieve anything, then it's market failure. Then you can say that doesn't make any sense to anybody. So we can't even have a conversation about that, because obviously he wrote that, never understood it. Okay, now with that in mind, maybe what we should do is just have a look at the two most common allegations of market failure. As it would be said, these two are the like big ones. Then we get a whole lot of small ones, which we're not sure whether they represent market failure. The first is the existence of monopolies. Now, you know what a monopoly is. A monopoly is one which has got the market, and there are different reasons why monopolies exist, and different forms of monopolies, which you could get, but it's only when we get it. Now, this whole line of thinking that we've got market failure, government intervention, all came because of what happened in the United States in the late 1980s. Now, to understand what happened, to understand this argument, you have to understand what happened. So again, if you were in my postgraduate course, you would have quite a few articles to read about what actually happened in the 1890s. So it's no use in simply looking at the theory without looking at the context in which the theory happened. Now, of course, what happened there is very famous. It's the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed in the 1890s. And that is the anti-competition legislation, for somehow called competition legislation, where the competition's not working. And as you know, that's what's now filtered all around the world. It's taken a long time to get to some countries. I think it's correct, I think, to say. It only came to South Africa after 1994. England, South Africa have had competitive legislation, but not in the Sherman Antitrust format. We had Restrictive Practices Act and so on. The American situation is a different kettle of fish, and we've now inherited that kettle of fish with our modern competition regime, which we've got. Now, the thing that happened in the 1980s, I will just give you the word, because if you listen to the news, the American news, it comes up quite often. It was what is known as a progressive era. And so even today, almost every day, the Democratic Party will say, you know, they represent a progressive view. Now, you might think that's just a word, but it's more than a word. It's reflecting that particular era. And it lasted until about 1921 and then went away. But the idea never went away. The progressive era went. So it forms part of it. Now, the interesting thing is if you go back and read the Sherman antitrust debates and the argument and what happened there, the argument was really about the railways. The railways were ganging together, and when they were ganging together, it was for the purposes of introducing monopoly profits. And when you read the research which is done by people like George Stigler, who got the Nobel Prize, it turns out there's very, very little evidence at all that there were any monopolies. It actually became more logical, and in fact, that turns out to be more closer to the truth. The idea of the government intervention was not to get rid of the monopolies, but to be able to impose the monopolies. When people try to put a monopoly, it's not very successful. So if the government then gets involved, and the government establishes a commission, and the commission then will set the tariff, and nobody can depart from the tariff, you actually get the monopoly which you think you're trying to get away. Now, there's no suggestion at all that the cost of invention is so as to achieve zero economic profits. Now, this is really quite easy. If you have a market, as happened in South Africa with the bread cartel, which involved Pioneer Food, if you have a look at the profits which the bread firms were making, and that which we'll look at in the next lecture in greater detail, you'd have a look and say, what were the profits? And you say, okay, let's assume they had like a profit margin of 50%. You can say, yeah, you can see there's the profit margin of 50%. So what we would be able to intervene, and let's say that we want to get the intervention down to margin to 5%, then you can say, well, the intervention can't be more than the difference between the profits and the profits we think which we'd have to get. So you'd be able to work out quite accurately what that cost of intervention has been. Now, if you go and look at the Pioneer Food, and we'll look at that in the next lecture anyhow, you will see there was no suggestion at all that that's the cost of the anti-competitive behavior, and the intervention will cost so much, and then we'll get to the position we want to be. In fact, the intervention is not based on the fact that you can demonstrate that there are monopoly profits, but on what is presumed to be anti-competitive structures or anti-competitive behavior. So we'd say if two people got together and they had breakfast together and they spoke about price, you would say that's collusive behavior, and therefore they are guilty of non-competitive and they must pay a fine. If you say, did they implement it? You say it doesn't matter. It's their behavior which we're concerned about. If you say the market is concentrated, you say that structure is non-competitive, and therefore we must break up the market, which was the American way, which you've got. And say, but can you do an analysis to show us what the cost is, what the benefit would be? Then the answer is no. We just look at the behavior. That's why Mr. Justice Bork, who had the job of trying to prosecute antitrust behavior for a very long period of his life, eventually had to say to himself, what is the purpose of the competitive antitrust legislation? What is it trying to achieve? If you say we're going to try to reduce the monopoly profits, you could understand it. And when he pointed out that actually it's not going to achieve that at all, eventually the answer was the antitrust legislation is there to protect antitrust legislation. Competition is to be protected for the sake of competition itself, not because of the outcomes of competition. So in all the evidence that I can find over the last 100 years has demonstrated the first point I want to make. There's never been a golden age of monopolies. We never had an era which we could do. Now there's another phenomena which for reasons not clear to me, we never see anything written about. We did see quite a lot written up in the 1970s, and then it simply disappeared. In the 1970s, there was a great deal of concern about this, and we had a big investigation in Europe and the Rome Accord to try and work out what happened. The evidence was that profits have been declining. So if you take, say, measure profits as a percentage of turnover, as percentage of sales, then that figure has been going down for over 100 years. The reason is not clear to me why that's not pursued more vigorously today. Yeah? And also what's the corollary to that, which people have realized, but I don't think they've understood the cause of it, is that the tax revenues from companies have also been declining. Maybe in the next lecture I'll bring out a slide to show you from the US examples. So less and less income is coming from profits of companies, because one of the reasons is there have been less and less profits. Now, if that's the case, you would think, well, we don't need to have any Sherman Antitrust Act. We don't need to have any competition legislation at all, because there's no evidence of a problem. And not only is there no evidence of problems, looking at the way the profits are declining, there is no problem. And worse than that, we're not sure whether the economy can function, because we have companies that don't produce significant profits. There will be no companies. And where's the receiver revenue going to get his tax revenues from if they're not coming from companies? That's a separate debate that we can have. Okay, the other great thing which we have, which is argued, and this is also an interesting one, is externalities. So you say, why do we have to worry about market failure? You say there's monopolies. You say, well, I don't think we can find monopolies. And you say, okay, but we also have to worry about externalities. It's not clear to me, as I have studied this and thought about it, that externalities is an example of market failure. It's always regarded as a market failure because those situations that you can demonstrate are non-Pareto optimum, as we will have a look. Where I have interpreted this is slightly different, and that is that the market does not capture all costs. The market is very efficient. It reduces the costs to the very minimum and the very limited, and therefore there are some costs which it does not capture. A very good example would be pollution. Just take, for example, a factory that uses water, and so assuming that factory, because it uses water, is built right next to a river. And so what it would do, it would draw fresh water from the river, it would use the water, it would pollute the water, and then would pump the polluted water into the river, which we would not particularly like. Now, why would it do that? Because if it doesn't do that, it's got to pay for cleaning it up. And if it pays for cleaning it up, then what would happen is its cost of production is going to go up. And if other manufacturers don't have the same cost of production, have a different way of doing it, then he would find himself going out of business. And so there is an incentive not to capture all the costs. And there's other examples which we can have a look at. Now, as I have already indicated, something which is Pareto optimal is when the actions of one consumer is not made worse off by another consumer. Now imagine that you are in the factory which is just downstream from the factory that's causing the pollution. And you also need to use water. So under those circumstances, what would happen is the factory which wants to use the water has to clean the water. So they would have to clean the water, and the cost of them cleaning the water would be in the cost of their products. So the consumers who are going to get the products from consumer upstream won't be paying for it. Consumers downstream will have to pay for it. And therefore, the upstream consumers, you can argue, are placing a burden on the downstream consumers. So under those things, you could say this market is not Pareto optimal. So the only way to solve this, or a way to solve this problem, there's more than one way, is to internalize the costs. How would you internalize the cost? The government would pass legislation to say that when you pollute water, you clean water. Polluter pays the person. And therefore, you would say not Pareto optimal. To make it Pareto optimal, government intervention, market failure, government intervention, and therefore externalities is an example of government intervention justified in terms of market failure, and the specific form of market failure that we get is government is the externality. Now that sounds very plausible, but I don't think it is plausible, because it's not clear to me this is a market problem. If you had the exact same thing saying communist Russia and it didn't have a market at all, you had a centralized control, you're still going to get exactly the same problem. Firms are still going to cause pollution, somebody's still got to think about how to clean it, and the cost would have to be cleared. It seems to me, and I think there's a good case to make, this is really a question of defining property rights correctly. If you pollute water, you clean the water. So that's just a simple matter of getting the rights defined correctly. But externalities is the other second. Now, if you have a look at the arguments for government intervention, very seldom will you ever see that you can show that there is a monopoly. That's what we will look at in the next lecture. You can make quite a few cases for externalities, and you can get government intervention under those circumstances. But we get government intervention if you look at the actions of our own competition regime. You'll see that they intervene in a whole host of different things for a whole lot of different reasons. And in those, as we will see in the next lecture, they're not because you can show the market is not at an optimal position. That is because, according to the regime, there's an anti-competitive behavior. So it's a different reason. And so that's why I said in the beginning, when people say market failure, you have to first get a clear understanding what they mean by market failure. So in conclusion, we don't really have any clear evidence of market failure, not in the correct usage of the word. And this will become, I think, crystal clear in the next lecture when we look at the practical interventions in South Africa to see which it does fit. And almost always, when the government has intervened, the cost of intervention far exceeds the benefit. And as we will see in other cases, the government intervention causes a market failure in the technical sense, many magnitudes of the failure which existed before they intervened. So as I have said once before, once the government intervened, if there wasn't a government, you'd need to have a government to intervene to be able to get the government to stop intervening because it caused it. So in a way, I suppose, in the article which I got where the person that defined one of the things is market failure is the failure of the government, I can understand why people would come to that conclusion, but unfortunately, they have not come to that conclusion within the correct conceptual framework, which is what we are looking at. So the next lecture which we have, we will then have a look at practical examples in South Africa of government intervention, test them against the competitive market and test that against the theory of market failure. Thanks a lot.